I'm not a prison abolitionist. I think that we do imprison people who've committed crimes, and I think there's a strong social argument for that. However, I think our prison system should teach the right lessons. And what I actually saw in prison was that often even the notional rights which prisoners do have are ignored. So what I talk about a lot is the right to healthcare. So in theory, every prisoner in this country has the same right of access to healthcare as anyone who's not in prison. And judges make sentencing decisions on that basis. And if you speak to lawyers who work in the criminal justice system or to the police or to judges, they all believe that's the case. So they believe when they are sentencing someone to prison that healthcare access is as it should be. In reality, in prison, healthcare is withheld until the moment of crisis. So I'll give you a few examples of that, some from my experience, some that have been reported publicly. So in late February of 2020, I was housed on A Wing in Wandsworth, and one day a man collapsed because he had been smoking spice, and he'd had some sort of cardiac issue, breathing issue. He collapsed on the wing, and the officers prevented other prisoners from giving him CPR or any kind of first aid attention, put all the prisoners who were out back in their cells, and then proceeded to stand around this man who'd passed out in a circle, waiting for paramedics to arrive.
Really?
Yes. So none of them made any effort to do anything. And I think this is something that the prison system does to the people who work within it, which I think it really harms their human instinct for compassion and for kindness. And I think part of that's because prison is a horrible environment. As I said, it's noisy, there are violent people, there's danger, there's discord, and often you have only a few prison officers responsible for a wing where there might be 100 men out roaming about. So a way that I believe some prison officers, perhaps many prison officers, respond to that pressure and that stress is by crushing and making their own natural human instinct to be compassionate. And so you get this sort of behaviour where people stand around.
How did you feel as a prisoner to know that their regard for your life is that they're not even going to do anything in that situation?
Yeah, it's horrifying, right? And I think another moment I had in the early weeks in Wandsworth was I remembered realising at night time they only have a really skeleton staff on because the prison service is so understaffed. And so what that meant was I thought, well, hang on, if there's a fire, there's no possible way they can get everyone out in time. So if there was a fire, if they couldn't put it out, we would all die in our cells. And similarly, sort of a few months later, in the late summer of 2020, on Wandsworth's H Wing, there were cells on either side of the landing, so we could look out through our window flap, and we heard screaming. And across the way, one guy was assaulting the other man in his cell. Really, the screams coming from the guy who was being attacked were chilling. I can still remember them now. I feel them in my heart. And in that situation, one of the night staff came along, and she wasn't allowed to open the doors because the night staff at Wandsworth are typically not allowed to do that, don't have the keys to do that. And so she sort of kept trying to tell the man doing the assault to stop, again for about 20 minutes until someone senior enough to be allowed to open the door, was able to open it with some other officers in present and stop the assault. Another example is there was a chap called David Morgan who was in HMP Chelmsford, and he had been told he was going to be transferred to another prison, and he really didn't want to be. I think often being transferred to another prison means you don't know who you're going to end up with. You don't know what the new prison is going to be like. You might not like where you are, but at least it's a known quantity. So he really didn't want to be moved, and he took an overdose of his painkillers. And when he arrived in the prison reception to be put on the transport, he told the staff, "I've taken an overdose of painkillers. I can't travel." And they got a nurse to inspect him. The nurse said, "Well, no, I think he's just drunk, but we'll leave him in a holding pen."
Oh, they didn't believe him.
They didn't believe him. But they said, "Well, we'll observe him." And they put him in a holding cell in reception, which is a sort of perspex walled cell, so they could see him. And hours passed, and over those hours, David collapsed again and again and again, to to the extent that he had multiple fractures, all throughout his body, horrendous injuries. Eventually, having watched this for a period of hours, healthcare staff and prison staff decided that perhaps there was something in his suggestion that he'd taken an overdose, and they called an ambulance. Some days later, David died in hospital. Now, that was reported by the prison and probation ombudsman, who didn't do an investigation into every death in custody. And the details are horrific. I've not talked through the specific details of the injuries, but they are grim reading. And those are just some examples of how healthcare is withheld. And the result is that often prisoners will suffer life-changing impacts or even die when they shouldn't have. So just within healthcare then, you see there's a huge disconnect between what prisoners should be entitled to and what they're entitled to.